IWillDominate is a League of Legends pro who was a veteran, who played since the early seasons of League of Legends, but never won an LCS title. In fact, never made the final of NALCS, never made it to any of the really big international competitions in the LCS era, never qualified for Worlds, obviously never qualified for MSI in these sorts of tournaments or All-Star tournaments. And thanks to his career now, his post-playing career as a streamer, which was something he was quite popular for in the latter days of League of Legends, and hence why he transitioned to that lifestyle. His personality has sometimes meant that people dislike him, and there was obviously some recent drama where people got upset with how he vented in a frustrated manner with someone who donated to him. And so with him not having played for 3 whole splits, it's easy for newer fans to not know who he was, to forget about him, to not understand his career in the context of his peer group and the Western region. But the key point I want to make and outline in this video is that IWillDominate was a good player, was someone who certainly was a real prospect in the Western regions, could have done much more in his career, but had these certain turns that his career took where he would be close to accomplishing something greater or moving up to a higher level or playing for a better team. And each time either he was on the losing end or something happened that meant that wasn't able to take place. So we got to go back in time. So when IWillDominate first really appears, which is actually around Season 2, because Dignitas, who towards the end of Season 1, the preseason of Season 2, had managed to win a tournament, had become one of the best teams in NA at the time. It was really up in the air between TSM, who didn't have Dyrus yet, and CLG, who didn't have Double Lift yet, and obviously would earlier next year, and then Dignitas as to who the best team was. There was this real competition going on there. And obviously the Epic Gamer team before that, but that had started to break up at this point. Now, Dignitas had won their tournament and with Jat as their jungler, and obviously Jat left. He had the choice to become a Riot developer or level designer, or become, well, not a level designer because there's not fucking levels in League of Legends, but game designer. And instead he obviously chose to become a commentator, and IWillDominate was brought in as the replacement for Jat in Dignitas. And he did well, and Dignitas did well. They had 5 top 3s that year in notable events, obviously many of them in NA, but with international competition. They were one of the best teams in North America, and in fact they peaked coming in towards Worlds, and they managed to qualify for Worlds in 2nd place. They placed ahead of CLG and behind TSM, who were the kings of NA at the time, thanks to CLG themselves kind of dropping off towards Worlds with their own problems there. Obviously at Worlds they had the issue where they lost to like Saigon Jokers, and they were mentally broken, and there was all those issues that went on with Dignitas there. That was kind of a clusterfuck. Then the problem was the LCS era was going to start in Season 3, but IWillDominate was banned. And I can't say too much about that topic because it's not my place to say, but I will say there is so much fuckery in that story of how he was banned and why he was banned and the way it was done that I hope one day that does come out, because it's an absolutely disgraceful story. It's another example of abuses of power that took place within League of Legends by a tyrannical top-down hierarchy who just did things in an arbitrary manner based on their own whims and personal decisions. And it wasn't based on him being a toxic player or someone who needed to be removed or needed to be disciplined. Now, yes, he certainly was a rager, and like many NA pros and many top pros in general, he was someone who certainly didn't have a problem talking shit to people and going at people he perceived coming at him, but he absolutely was not someone on the level of, for example, what happened with Incarnation, where Incarnation, it certainly seems, was DDoSing people and was being quite antisocial, quite obnoxious in his behavior beyond just being a bit of an asshole. And obviously himself overcame his issues there with his ban, which many people thought would be a lifetime ban, and eventually did become a player. I won't say he became reformed, but he just became a player who didn't do those things anymore and became a top level pro and exploited his talent. IWillDominate was not like that. It was highly unfair the way he was treated. But here's the key thing. He could have just quit. In fact, you know what? He should have quit. And the reason why I say that, he should have quit, it should have killed his career, is because now we know, yes, League of Legends was going to have like 4 years worth of LCS, and it is still running now, 5 years, I guess, and it's had all the tournaments since then, and the money has only increased since then. The salary has gone up like tenfold, and all the options as to what you can get, and all the perks of being a player are amazing now. But back then, when he was banned for the first season of LCS, that in many ways should have killed his career. Like, when we look back in hindsight now, Like, we know that it would later turn out that NA talent was hard to come by, that a lot of the old pros from his day were going to fall off and would be gone soon enough, a lot of even the stars, and that with importing, it would be valuable to have NA players who were good at certain positions, like support, like jungle, as we've seen. And so, yes, knowing now, we know, obviously, just stick around, just play as long as you can, don't retire. But a lot of people back then would have retired. I mean, at the exact same time, there was a jungler over in Europe who got a ban. He was called Linak, who played against All Authority, AAA, and he absolutely was one of the best junglers in the entire West, arguably in the world. He was one of the few that could really go against Diamond Procs, and that's why AAA was good at the end of 2011, early 2012, and obviously later they had issues, and hence why Yellow Star and Rated and the likes of Soaz all left them. But that guy got a ban, just straight up retired, just left, was never seen from again, didn't really play from beyond that, never made a proper run at going to LCS again, just retired. People have to understand that becoming a League of Legends pro at the time, with the open circuit, you weren't going to get banned. There was no fear of that. But at the time, it was something new to be a pro in League of Legends. And so when people lost their first initial good opportunities, or they had a good situation, but then the next one wasn't quite as good, many of them just retired. I mean, famously, I wrote a story about this when I worked for Team Acer, about a team called Curse EU, that had a number of really talented players on it, like Extinct, etc. And the guy just outright retired after a little period of time. He tried again, and then when things didn't quite work out, he just retired. Again, someone who could have been a fantastic player. Citizen Wayne was another one. If you go back to Season 2, this is a guy who really looked like he had a lot of talent, who could have gone far. He tried to get into a couple of teams, didn't work out for him. He just retired, stopped playing, became a sub. Yes, there are some people out there who stuck around, but not many of them were the big name people like IWillDominate, and especially not people who got a ban like he did. Because what he did in Season 3 is, he didn't just sit around doing nothing. He came over and he started playing in Curse Academy, which was the challenger team at that time, and there wasn't a proper challenger circuit, but he played in the competitions they had, and the team wasn't even that good actually when you look at some of the players now, and you look at them then in terms of the results. They weren't accomplishing that great results, they were okay, but by sticking around, he put himself in position where when St. Vicious stepped back from being a starting jungler in the team, he could come in and become the starter. He earned his spot, he'd shown he was good enough, he'd stuck around, the ban got lifted, and so Season 4, in came IWillDominate to the LCS, and became a starter for what then was Curse, and obviously a year later would become Team Liquid. And in the first split of LCS, they managed to place 4th place. And at the time, he was playing like Elise, Vi, Xin Zhao. These were the champions he was on, and he already showed himself to be good in his first LCS split. Next split comes along was the summer. Again, Curse finishes 4th. This is where the whole Team Liquid 4th meme came from, and yes, they'd done it also in Season 3 in the spring split, but the problem they had was they would get to the semi-finals, they'd be in with a shout, and then they would just get beaten by whoever they played at that point in time. So they played Cloud9 in both these instances, and yes, they were just beaten quite easily. Unfortunately, the summer split, also back then, you used to qualify for Worlds by coming 3rd in the summer split. That's the last qualification spot. If you made it to the finals, you automatically qualified. Winning just made you 1st seed or 2nd seed. And then the 3rd place team would also qualify for Worlds. So in the summer split, Curse made it to the semi-finals, lost to Cloud9, and then they played LMQ, the all-Chinese team with Xiaowei Zhao and a bunch of other players, Vasily, Moore, all these guys, Ackerman, and they managed to get to a 5th game, and they lost the decisive 5th game, so they didn't go to Worlds just by a single game. Now, in both semi-finals they played that year, they'd got wrecked by Cloud9. Cloud9 was a very good team, and obviously Cloud9's macro was phenomenal at the time, and that's one of the problems, is that back then, the system was not a good system. I mean, first of all, they'd only just moved in Season 4 to actually even having best of 5 semis. Before that, we had best of 3s. Then that whole thing where you had to come top 3 just in LCS to qualify. There was no regional. There was no extra component. It made it just like basically you had 2 chances. You had your semi-final and then you had the 3rd place match. And so that was it for the whole year. Your team plays poorly then, or plays opponents who play a great game, and you're done. Now, in summer season, again, he was maining Elise, but he also switched it up. He played Evelyn, he played Nunu actually, played some decent Nunu. The problem is in Season 4, there were some clear roster issues with Curse which held them back. They had players who never were going to be the best at their positions and had their issues. So one of them famously was Voyboy, because Voyboy after Season 3 had switched to being a mid laner. He'd gone from the top lane to the mid lane because obviously he used to play a lot of AP champions in the top lane. Now, in the spring split, he'd really had his problems adapting. He was very up and down, and he'd have some famously poor games. By the summer split, he started to come on a bit towards the end of the summer split, and he obviously had a decent run in the playoffs. He did well against CLG. He didn't do that well against Cloud9, had his issues there. And so, as your star player of the team, him being up and down, it's no wonder they finished fourth in these splits. Like, it kind of makes sense. That's reasonable as to where they could if he's your main carry, your star player. Then you got to look at the fact that, okay, they'd gotten Quaz into the lineup, and Quaz was clearly a talent, but was still adapting to the team. And then the other mainstay from a long time was Cop. And Cop famously was the super average AD carry. He'd be all right. He'd never be great. Apparently, he didn't put in a lot of effort to the game as a pro. And so he just stayed static. And so them being the fourth best team actually shows that IWillDominate was a good player, and that in general the team played pretty well, and actually I think punched above their weight. Like, you look at the lineup they had, they should have been like the fifth or sixth best team in NA, but they managed to get to top 4 each time. And then they even were close to coming third in the summer split, but they didn't manage it. And realistically, you look at that team, they weren't good enough to. Then you go over to Season 5. Now, Season 5, they become Team Liquid. They get in the talents. They get in Piglet in the off-season, obviously world champion 2 years ago. They get in Phoenix, a guy who, admittedly, had been a top laner himself, but now had come in at the mid lane and had some talent, clearly. In this third split, in the first split of the year, the spring split, people forget this, they managed to finish third. Now, when they got to play in the semi-finals, they played Cloud9 again, the old nemesis. But what people forget is this is the one where realistically they should have won. Like when they were Curse and they played Cloud9, they got swept 3-0 each time. Who gives a fuck? This was the one where they were up, and Cloud9 had to do a reverse sweep, and there was even a mad scenario in Game 3 where I think it was Cloud9 just gave Team Liquid like a Juggermore comp, which at the time was very strong still, but somehow still managed to win the game. And so in this scenario, this is the one where after they then won the third place game and finished third, you look at it and you say, they finished third. If you could have done that in the summer split before, you qualify for Worlds. If they still had the same rules later on, you'd qualify for Worlds. But here's part of the tragedy again. Now you've got a better team, and now you'll see how still they're just a little bit away. In the spring split, now you see IWillDominate switching up his meta again. Yes, he plays Nunu again when it's relevant, but he plays Sejuani, which obviously Diamondprox have innovated, and now it's started to be played. Rek'Sai was out, and he was playing that a lot. He constantly could adapt to the new meta and get those 2 or 3 strong champions. We came to the summer split, and they came in, and they had to play TSM this time when they got to the semis. And they lost to TSM. Even though a lot of people had them favoured to beat TSM, this was famously when the team was actually very strong in lane at this point in time. They had Xpecial also instead of Bunny Fufu that they had the year before. They had a very strong lineup on paper. They had very good individual players. And in laning phase, in early parts of the game, the first 15, 20 minutes, they would be really strong. And sometimes they could power that through to win. But if other teams start to come back, their macro decisions mid-game were noticeably very up and down and often poor in the really key moments. And from behind, when other teams got ahead of them in the mid-game, they really struggled. And that's one of the things that TSM schooled them on. And in the playoffs especially, you saw the shot calling became even more strained. You also have to add in, at the time, they were coached by Peter, who, if you remember, had been the coach of LMQ the year before. And I have to say, he was a very flawed coach. It wasn't that he couldn't be a coach and couldn't do it at all, but he came from a team, LMQ, that was all about team fighting. That was all about, like, lots of kills. You're going to die a lot, give up a lot of deaths, but in order to get a lot of kills, you can create a lot of skirmishes, a lot of team fights. You've got a star mid laner in Zhao Weizhao who's going to win a lot of the fights. And that's how you're going to battle. It's a Chinese style of fighting, and that's going to win you the game. And he came in and he had this team where that wasn't the way they played at all. And they didn't have the shot calling, the cohesion to play that way, but that's his coaching philosophy that he implemented onto the team. And also, I know from talking to some of the players in that team, he didn't really listen to a lot of the feedback and implement it well within the team. He still had his rigid way of how he wanted to play the game. Then you've got to add in, they had Phoenix, who, yes, was fantastic if you put him on Azir, who had 1 or 2 other champions he could play, but then he had a very small champion pool, and beyond those, he was very limited, actually, and wouldn't have as much impact on the game. But again, you saw in this split, where they managed to finish third again, that, again, IWillDominate was adapted to the meta. He continued to play Rek'Sai. Now he brought in all the other champions you could play. He brought in Gragas that he was playing. He played Nidalee. He played Echo, which actually could be played at the time in the jungle. And he was having success on all these champions. You could see he could go back and forth between kind of the farm junglers, the more tanky junglers, and he could go and play the carry junglers as well. And crucially, this was another tragedy. So they finished third in the summer split. Remember, if that had been the rule set of Season 4 and Season 3, they'd already be through the Worlds. IWillDominate would have played at Season 5 Worlds. But there was the regional system now. And unfortunately, in the regional system, by coming third, they were waiting at the end. They were the final bosses of that gauntlet. And if you remember, it was that epic run by Cloud9, who at the time was basically just high shot calling paired with Jensen being really sick. That's it. The rest of the team was a train wreck, but they managed to win this series, and famously, Team Liquid had a collapse there, and therefore, again, just missed qualifying for Worlds. They didn't go in Season 5, and then that's it. IWillDominate retired. Now, first of all, look at the guy's career. He had to battle back. He was already one of the best in NA, like maybe the second or third best jungler at the time going into Season 3. But thanks to his ban, he didn't give up, but he had to battle all the way from playing in Challenger and then earn his spot on a Team Liquid and then wait for the team to get better, just to get back to be in the position where he could be considered a top 4 jungler in NA, where his team could be top 4 and then top 3 in NA. He had to battle all the way back just to get back there again, and he was legitimately in position to qualify for a whole bunch of Worlds. Now, obviously, he did qualify in Season 2. In Season 3, obviously, he couldn't play due to the ban. Season 4, he was one game from qualifying and going to Worlds. And then in Season 5, he had 2 key chances that didn't work out. He was one game off in terms of the spring semi-final, which obviously would have given you more circuit points also. Would have been interesting in that sense. I think they had circuit points in Season 5. Yeah, they did. And then he was 2 games off in the regional, obviously, and therefore didn't get off. And you could also say he was 1 game off in the spring season in as much as he would have come top 2 in the season, and obviously, and made the finals. Now, IWillDominate as a player. First of all, in terms of his strengths, he had good mechanics, and he always had good mechanics. And then he applied those good mechanics, as you'd expect from someone who's mechanically good, to have a strong pressure ganking style of play. Now, not pure gank. He wasn't like a Yankos or a Shulk or a Trick in that sense, but it was a pressure ganking style of play. It was moving around the map. It wasn't just farming up. And he always, in every meta, had 2 to 3 strong picks he could play. Now, I will say, he wasn't like a player who could play like 6 champions and could go wherever he wanted. He would play the meta champions that were strong, and he would usually have a pick that he always tried to work in there that often didn't work. So I'm thinking of, like, in the early days, it was Wukong, then it was Rengar and Kha'Zix, and later on he even tried to play Jarvan, if you remember. That was kind of a bit iffy. But he always had the strong meta picks, and he was always experimenting with the other ones to see what else was viable, and could always go back to the tanky jungler as well as play the strong junglers, which actually was rare for people who were pressure style junglers. He was also someone who actually had some fire in him. That's where part of the personality, when it's channeled in a negative way, comes across as being a whiner, being a rager, but he had fire within him. When you've got players like Voyboy, who can be very emotionally fragile, when you've got guys like Xpecial, who's more of the passive aggressive type guy, he's not going to directly state his opinion as much, he's going to be a bit more reserved with it, or he's going to see how things go. Well, you've got someone like Quaz, who isn't going to talk a whole lot. You've got someone like Phoenix, who couldn't even speak English at the time. And Piglet, obviously, again, very limited. He played with a bunch of different people in his career where there wasn't a leadership figure in these teams. And so he came forward to take that role, to be a motivator, to be a leadership figure, to be someone who cared about how the shot calling was done. And obviously, as a jungler, could play a role in it in that sense, even though naturally probably wasn't suited to be a shot caller, had to do it out of necessity at times. Now, his style of play meant that actually he had some very interesting matchups, because over the years he actually always had good games against CLG in his career. Actually, he used to have pretty good games against Cloud9, even though they smashed him in the playoff. It got smashed by them in the playoffs a lot. And famously, he used to be doing pretty well against Tip, actually. And Tip obviously had Rush, who for my money was the best jungler in NA for most of that period of time. Unfortunately for IWillDominate, throughout his whole career, TSM was always a kryptonite. And part of that was TSM obviously had better players a lot of the time, had better coaching, better cohesion in terms of the unit. But bizarrely, one of the other teams he never used to do very well against was actually Dignitas, his old team, and some of his old players. Not sure why that was, because they were never usually that good a team, actually. Now, part of the criminality of the criminal nature of IWillDominate's career, unfortunately, I feel, is that not only did he just miss going to some Worlds or making an LCS finals, having a chance to win LCS, but I also feel like thanks to the ban setting him back a few years, and then thanks to some of his teams being perceived as losers and chokers and not making it far, and then adding in the fact that his personality and the fact that people knew he could be outspoken or he could be a bit brash, for some reason he didn't get the breaks he really needed. Like, I actually think this is a guy who, by all rights, should have been recruited to TSM or Cloud9. TSM, I think, in Season 5 should have recruited him actually at the end of Season 5 and also at the beginning of Season 5 when they made the switch from Amazing and then ended up getting Santorin. I think they would have been much better with having one less import slot and actually having IWillDominate take that position. I think he would have done fantastically with Bjergsen. I also think that if you'd have put him over, and he also could have played a role in the shot calling. I also think if you go and you put him over onto Cloud9 after they had to get rid of Meteos, I think he could have done very well there. I think his mentality would have fit really well with Jensen's. And yes, they would have lacked for high shot calling still, but I think this would have been a better approach all in all. And again, it's not using up an import slot because he's an NA resident. So I feel like he could have played for either of these top teams and been in LCS finals, been winning LCS, been going to Worlds, and had much better a career. And so when people look back and they complain at the lack of NA pro talents, here was a guy who was an NA talent, and he was a talent, and he was consistently good, and yes, he didn't have things bounce in his direction a bunch of times, and ultimately, yes, you have to look at that and say, right, you weren't a champion, but I also feel like you look at some of those teams, he was the best part of some of those teams, one of the better elements, and a guy who did try a lot, and didn't just give up, and didn't just cash in, and sit back, and just play for the money, and try sometimes, and not matter if he cared, like some of the players out there did that I wouldn't name, but I could name if I wanted to. He's someone who really did try and unfortunately had all these factors that went against him and meant that ultimately he didn't get the success that his talent could have had and that his game could have had in his career. And I hope that people don't just remember things that happen every now and then when he was frustrated on a stream, because his pro career was something worth celebrating.
I'm Kelsey Moser from Yahoo Esports, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel, where no sandbagging goes unscrutinized.